So once again, a very warm welcome to the chapel here at Walsingham House at Abbotswick. I should explain that we have a little retreat house here, and some of the team have remained together in isolation. That's why we have a little community here, and thank God with all these talents, with the technology and the music and the reading and the display in front of the altar and so many things. So we thank God for the opportunity to celebrate the Migrants Mass today, even in these very unusual circumstances. And I do realise that it's a bit ironic to speak about journeys in a time of lockdown. But in his very first encyclical, Pope Francis said this: "Faith is not a light which scatters all our darkness, but a lamp that guides our steps in the night and suffices for the journey." In all their glorious diversity, the one thing that unites our migrant communities is that they've all been on a journey, illuminated by faith, yet sometimes very difficult, fleeing a war zone, fleeing persecution simply for being Christian, or fleeing because they're so educated they're a threat to the ruling party. Sometimes, worst of all, making a forced journey as a trafficked slave. Even when the journey is by choice, it's often far from easy, with many months of waiting for papers to be processed, long periods of separation for families. I remember welcoming a group of Filipino nurses to a parish as they arrived to serve in the hospital. After the bright smiles of welcome, and as we got chatting, tears flowed when they spoke of husbands, wives, children, who they would not see for months. The journey in today's gospel resonates deeply with this. As Mary and Joseph carry Jesus to Egypt, it is, in a way, a little church on the move. The nascent blessed sacrament carried with tender care, even as they journey through hostile lands. As that little family made their way to Egypt, as both migrants and refugees, we see grit and strength rooted in faith. Notice the hands of St. Joseph. Hands marked by the scars of manual work, the moment where the wood broke or the saw slipped. These are the hands tenderly carrying Christ on that journey. And they're the hands of many migrant workers through the ages. Sometimes the scars are those of manual labour. Sometimes they are the wounds of separation. Migrant doctors, engineers, business leaders and scientists feel the pain right now of separation from extended family members, especially when news arrives of parents or siblings who are ill, or indeed news of bereavement. Coronavirus is teaching all of us many hard lessons, and one of them is undoubtedly that we understand separation in a very different way than many of us did 6 or 7 weeks ago. Migrants have borne the pain of such separation for decades. As we clap for the nurses, the key workers, the teachers, the cleaners and the care workers from the UK and from countries across the world, we know that there is even greater separation, as many of them are staying away from home in rooms acquired by the NHS, or staying in part of a flat zoned off from the rest of their family in case they bring infection home. Dear friends, if you or a family member are in that situation today, know that Mary understands, Joseph understands, Jesus understands. Their very first journey after the birth of Jesus was a journey of separation, away from the home country and extended family. So faith, as Pope Francis rightly says, does not scatter all our darkness, but it does illuminate and guide our steps. And just as for the Holy Family, when Joseph trusted in the divinely inspired dream, I have seen so many migrant families where their trust in faith is breathtaking. I once turned up to bless the house of a family from Kerala. When I got there, I thought I was in the wrong place. The estate agent's sign was still in the little garden. There were no curtains at the windows, but there were people inside. And when they opened the door, I was shown into a house that was entirely empty, except for a wonderful display of religious imagery, candles and a crucifix on and around the mantelpiece. and their delight as I blessed the house was tangible. Father, they said, we wanted the very first thing in our new house to be God's blessing. I learned something that day. And a few years ago, I stood in the simplest and most moving church I have ever encountered, in the refugee camp known as the Jungle in Calais. In amongst the mud, the appallingly poor dwellings, the overflowing toilets, and so much else that was so wrong and sad about the jungle, was the church of St. Michael the Archangel, built of rough tarpaulin and wood by Eastern Rite Christians from Ethiopia and Eritrea. Can you imagine the journey that they had? They were on boats where just 30 survived of 100 who'd started the journey across the Mediterranean. They'd walked literally thousands of miles. And yet, when they finally arrived in Calais, they built the church before they built anywhere for themselves to live. We wanted to give thanks to God, they said, for getting us this far. They built the church before they built their home. In parishes, the faith of migrant communities shines in amazing devotional prayer, often well into the night. Many a priest has given over the keys of the church to ethnic chaplaincies and said, just put the keys through the door when you're finished. And the letterbox rattles at 1 or 2 in the morning. Why? Because very often you're navigating between shifts, and a longer time of prayer in the evening allows those on both day and night shifts to take part. And then there's the music. Song that is vibrant, energetic, and proclaims God in the very joy and energy of what is being sung, usually with some dancing, always magnificently uplifting. I'm so pleased that we're able to have a flavour of that in today's Mass, from the children of St. Anthony's in Forest Gate, and from Felicia and Art in their wonderful solos. But even with such glorious and trusting faith, life is not all joy, song, dance, blessing. There are times on the journey when migrants meet a wall, not a bridge. They meet a fist rather than a hand of outstretched welcome. I have a vivid memory of a young man arriving at church with his face bloodied and bruised. The night before, walking home, he'd been beaten up for no other reason than the colour of his skin. He was a nurse at the local hospital. Those beating him up would not have known that, of course. But where was he the next day? At Mass. And he was most certainly welcomed and cared for that day. I'm sure the poor man had never had so much tea and cake. And he was back serving as a nurse just a few days later. Jesus is so clear throughout Scripture. We're all brothers and sisters. We're all made in God's image and likeness. That is the truth of our faith, expressed in a great diversity of culture and appearance. Each one of us made in God's image. And yet, some migrants come here as slaves, trafficked workers in brutal conditions. Cardinal Vincent, Pope Francis, the Metropolitan Police have worked together to combat this terrible evil which shames our world. And yet, even here, there is a little light. It does not scatter all the darkness, but it does illuminate. Because we can learn from those who've been into such an abyss. We can learn and we can get better. As Pope Francis said in the letter to young people of the world last year, Christus Vivit, some realities of life are only seen with eyes cleansed by tears. Perhaps all of us have wept a little more often in recent weeks. Let our tears help us to see through fresh eyes and ever more deeply meet hatred with love, transforming the darkness of prejudice and cruelty into the light of hope. What sustains almost every migrant journey is work. And as we clap for NHS workers, key workers and essential workers of all faiths and all nationalities, the sad truth is they're often amongst the lowest paid. How often I have seen families where one parent works a night shift and the other a day shift so they can feed their children. The parents seeing each other just for a snatched hour, morning and evening, perhaps a day off together once a month. The hard work of those from the UK and from beyond these shores is exceptional. And with many others, I pray that a consequence of coronavirus is a re-evaluation of the dignity, the decency, the wages and the voice of the lowest paid yet utterly essential workers. The dignity of the human person, from conception to natural death, is ingrained in our Catholic teaching. And today it's good to be crystal clear that part of that dignity is the fact that every person should earn a real living wage. It's also there in our Catholic teaching right back to Pope Leo XIII in 1891. And how do we wrap all this together? Well, perhaps the very best way to sum it up is in the simple words of the prophet Micah from our first reading. May these words be the guiding light for how we meet all peoples, all nations, all the time, inspired by Jesus Christ. Act justly, love tenderly, walk humbly with God.